So without further ado, welcome to Scarlett. Scarlett, it's great to see you.
Thank you, Matt. It's great to see you.
Now, Scarlett, you've got a huge amount of experience in digital health. Before we get into some of that and your thoughts on healthcare and innovation, perhaps you could just start by just telling us a little bit about your role.
Sure. Well, thank you, Matt. It's my pleasure and my honor to be here again this year. So I have 3 different responsibilities here at Prudential. My title is Managing Director of Ecosystems. So my first role is to head up strategic investments. So strategic investments is what we define as investments into companies which are relevant to Prudential's long-term growth. And we happen to invest into the health tech space specifically. So our investee companies include the likes of Prudential, which is the first Hong Kong unicorn to go public. And then another example, Indonesia-based Halodoc, which is the leading telemedicine platform in Indonesia. And in fact, I think the winner from Galen Growth 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And my second responsibility is that I sit within the partnership team. So we look for partners to fit into our ecosystem. And my third responsibility is actually more as a founder and CEO for one of our new businesses in the region.
Superb. Well, you sound very busy.
I do have multiple jobs.
And I can't think of anybody probably more qualified to then therefore give us a bit of an insight into the world of digital health and digital health partnerships. And I have to say, before we get into this sort of the first question, that I would say that probably more than any other corporate, certainly any other insurer, Prudential is probably held up to be the most trailblazing in terms of digital health and digital health partnerships. Particularly with Pulse. So I think the company and you have done an amazing job and really showing the world what digital health and an insurer can look like. So look forward to hearing a bit more about that. But I thought we'd start more broadly. So healthcare, clearly 2021 coming into 2022, it still feels that we're really at the beginning of this, and there's a huge amount of opportunity still to come in digital health. And we've seen that the pandemic has accelerated things. We're all familiar with this, teleconsultation and the acceptance of teleconsultation, for example. But what do you see now as the sort of next opportunities just around the corner in digital health and healthcare?
Yeah, so great question, Matt. So first of all, I'm really pleased to see the growth in the healthcare space. Right. So if you look at the different sectors, it's biotech, it's medtech, and the services. And I would squarely put health tech as the fourth, vertical within healthcare, which is really receiving a lot of attention, right, as the sort of like the new kid on the block. Now, going back 2 years, I think COVID has really put the spotlight on healthcare, and also healthcare is here to stay, right? Meaning the governments that we see around the world are putting a strategic focus on healthcare. So this year, in terms of funding, we're seeing a 35% growth, just this year alone compared to last year. So I think there are tremendous amounts of opportunities here within healthcare, and they're here to stay for years, for many years indeed. Right. Now, going into the specific opportunities, I do think that health tech is one of the best opportunities there is within healthcare. Right. So health tech, as you have defined it, right? I mean, there's digital health, there's digital therapeutics. There's lots of areas within digital health as well. So, and this really sits at a very interesting intersection between healthcare and internet, digital, right? And direct to consumer. Okay. And healthcare is it's also a very specialized kind of field where different professionals specialize in, for example, medtech, for example, biotech. And I think that this is still the case for health tech because the requirement of understanding health tech business models is actually quite high because you have to understand technology, understand internet, understand consumer, direct to consumer plays. in addition to just the overall landscape within healthcare. And technology is here to stay, and technology is here to change all the different industries. So I'm super excited about the growth within health tech. So that's the first opportunity that I see. The second opportunity is really observing all the different demographic changes, right, that are going on. So if you look at populations, so in the US, there are baby boomers, right? In China, China is a rapidly aging society. So if you observe really globally, well, if global warming doesn't kill us all before that, it's really, even if you look at Asia, so 2/3 of the population in Asia by 2050 will be over the age of 60. All right, so along with aging, what comes with aging is really chronic disease, right? So it's really the prevention and the management of chronic diseases, right? It's cancer, for example, and cancer, anywhere going from the early detection of cancer all the way to therapeutics, to management, right? Cancer is even becoming more and more chronic these days, right? So I think the technologies that will move with the demographic trends within the world will also do very well in the future. Now, the third area that I see is really the humanizing aspect of healthcare. And what do I mean by humanizing? So if we look at some of the subsectors that have been doing really well, so for example, women's health, for example, mental health, right? These are areas, or even just primary care in places like China, because China lacks primary care, right? So these are sectors which didn't get that much attention in the past, but now going forward, I think there will be a lot more focus on these going forward. And for healthcare companies, if you ask the executives, right, what's important to you? These couple of years, there has been a lot of discussion on improving the patient experience, right? Instead of thinking, well, this is a medical device, deal with it. People are saying, how do we actually engage, right, with our users, or in this case, our patients? So I think the humanizing aspect is here to stay as well.
So that's great, and I guess along with that humanizing aspect, as well as more kind of focus on mental health or women's health, just the access that
yes.
digital brings is really significant, particularly in our part of the world.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, digital is scalable in nature. So technology can do many things that traditional healthcare, which is more sick care and more cure focused, can actually bring into the care space.
So that's great. So, very optimistic view of the future. I guess there are still, barriers. There's still some challenges, aren't there? What do you think are some of those challenges? Do you as an insurer, or in some of your other roles, face any particular challenges, and how do you look to overcome those?
Yeah, so I think there are many challenges within healthcare. So first, it takes a long time to really prove outcome. So and it takes time for clinical outcome to actually translate into savings, right, into cost savings. So I think time is one that is, quite different about the healthcare space and health tech space as well. The second challenge that I would say is that, there are very complex business models within the health tech space, right? So if you think about what needs to happen within health tech, by definition, there has to be some sort of technology, right? And some technologies are data-based, right? Very much based on, all the data that has been generating over the past 4 or 5 years. So tech has to be there, right? Clinical efficacy needs to be there.
Yeah.
Regulatory pathways, these are never easy, but do you have your FDA, right? Mm-hmm. So this is another, I think, very important pillar. And then lastly, what is the business model, right? Because health tech is again very different from some of the traditional healthcare sectors where it's very product driven, right? A drug, it's actually quite binary, right? Whether it works or not. But health tech has to capture the essence of the healthcare landscape, where you've got the patient in the middle, you've got doctors here, you've got the medical institutions here, providers. You have that primary relationship, and you also have to manage the supplemental relationships between the payers and the pharma. Right. So all that, putting everything together is really, answering the question of how do you get your service or products, from you into the hands of users or patients, right? And ultimately, who actually pays for this, right? Yeah. So if you look at it, it's actually a very complex business model play involving a lot of different stakeholders as well. So I think that's the second challenge. It's not that easy to get it right. And then lastly, I would make a remark on profitability, right? So after all, businesses are businesses, and I think for new sectors, people tend to have more patience. So they'll say it's fine if there's no profitability, for some time, especially in the internet place, right? So if you observe internet, it always starts with getting users, getting MAU, and hopefully DAU, getting engagement. And then with engagement with users, that leads to revenue. And ultimately, revenue leads to profits, right? So that is something that is still happening right now within the health tech space, right? So I think people will focus more on that going forward.
Yeah, I'm just curious about that last point, which is, I think a lot of corporates, and I hear this from insurers too, they struggle a little bit with the ROI. We all know what it's like to work in a big corporate. I mean, often if you're a product manager, you're expected to do a sort of business case and work out the ROI and the internal rate of return, etc. Yeah. And there's often like this tension, isn't there, between somebody that really is seeing the future and really wants to change and develop and transform, with other parts of the business, particularly the kind of CFO sort of area, who are looking for, what's the evidence this is going to work? When's the payback going to happen? Yeah. How do you navigate that piece? Because that's quite a complex thing in a large corporation to get right.
Yes, absolutely. You're right, Matt. It's in fact very difficult to navigate because there are different stakeholders, which have different KPIs. Right. So the CFOs have a completely different set of KPIs than people who, for example, do things like operations, or maybe it's new business development, etc. Right. So I agree that it's very difficult. I think that in places like the US, typically the ROI calculation is a bit easier, because people know essentially, this is how much we spend and this is how much we save. Now in Asia, in different countries, that ROI calculation is actually different. And it's actually, again, different country by country, right? So doing that calculation is actually pretty, I would say, complex in itself, in a large organization. Yeah, so completely agreed. Yeah.
That's good. So it sounds like you've been able to accept a level of ambiguity in those numbers and, probably make best estimates, but still proceed perhaps not with the, the reassurance of, a decade of kind of results behind you. So that's probably a big part of why you've been able to push so strongly, I would guess, into sort of some of the partnerships that you've done. Let's switch tack a little bit to sort of therapeutic areas. And you mentioned some of these already, like women's health and mental health. And sort of, mental health has been particularly interesting, of course, this year, a lot of focus. We, in our most recent survey, it was something like 500 mental health companies worldwide, big chunk of those in the US, but also a lot in Asia as well. And we've seen a big shift, I think, in terms of willingness to talk about mental health, and also the ability for digital health to actually help in that area. But of course, that's only 1 or 2 out of 70 different therapeutic areas. And we've also seen, I guess, the insurers go on a bit of a journey. So everybody was sort of starting with the wellness platforms and giving kind of rewards for activity. But I think you're quite focused on probably several therapeutic areas. Can you tell us a little bit about what some of those focus areas are for you?
Yeah, sure, definitely. So I think first of all, telemedicine, right? So this is no surprise to anyone. I think telemedicine, telespecialty going forward is here to stay. I think elderly care specifically because, like I've mentioned, aging is happening. It's a tsunami. So more companies that can take care of elderlies, I think that's a very big area. And then along with it, chronic disease prevention and management, right? Certainly here to stay. Remote monitoring. I think remote monitoring through medical devices or IoTs or wearables or anything that really generates digital biomarkers, along with interfaces, right? So interfaces which are user or patient facing, or physician facing, right, with interfaces directly to the doctors. I think those platforms are here to stay, and we'll definitely see more development in that. I think sleep is an area which a lot of people have ignored this actually, but we do spend a third of our lives sleeping, and we understand awfully little about sleep, right? So what goes on in sleep, and there are also different diseases within the sleep area. So for example, let's just take sleep apnea, right? So 1 billion people globally actually have sleep apnea. And only 100 to 150 million of these people actually know that they have this condition, right? And then what follows from that is, what do you do with it, right? If you have it. And for most people, they don't even know, right? So I think sleep is a new area within health tech, which assisted by IoTs, devices, etc., will see a lot more growth going forward. So in addition to this, you've mentioned mental health. I think mental health was so lacking previously, and it's definitely here to stay as well. What else? Drug discovery. So AI in drug discovery, we began to see unicorns in the space, which I think is great because drug discovery tends to be very time consuming and very cost intensive as well. So I'm really glad to see the platforms which are developing in this area. And then I think lastly, internet plus health is the way to go. So platforms which offer, whether it's products or services or drugs or information, I think that will definitely be very popular going forward.
So this is probably a good segue into talking about sort of digital health solutions and how you choose those. But just before we get to that, so I'm curious on the therapeutic areas that you've mentioned. And of course, there are some very big ones in terms of oncology and cardio and diabetes and other chronic diseases. The ones that are really affecting mortality, and then you've got sort of some that have some kind of impact on quality of life or longevity, etc. How do you sort of in those therapeutic choices decide on them? Because do you always try and break it back to your insurer objective somewhere? Is how big a influence on therapeutic focus are your insurer objectives? For example, lost claims ratio or customer satisfaction, for example.
Yeah, that's a good question. So for us, we think with the customer at the center of everything that we do. So we care about what our customers actually care about, right? So what's top of mind issues for them? So you've named oncology, that's definitely important, right? Because people buy critical illness insurance products because they fear cancer. Right. You've mentioned cardiovascular, you've mentioned diabetes. These are really the top causes of death in developing and developed countries. So all these things are definitely things that we really focus a lot on. And we also believe that by doing good, we will do well. Right. So by managing our customers' health, they will be healthier, and we as Prudential will do well.
Okay. So let's just talk about health partnerships now and digital health tech partnerships, etc. And so I know Pulse has done a huge amount of partnerships here and probably elsewhere within Prudential as well, both in APAC and globally. How do you go about sort of understanding the market understanding where there might be a solution sort of externally in that big ecosystem of over 8,000 digital health startups and ventures. So maybe we could start with that. I'm interested in perhaps as well where you might decide to do a build internally, but maybe let's just start with the digital health ecosystem. How do you approach understanding it?
Yeah, so we approach it both inside out and also outside in, right? So inside out is by understanding what we actually want to build, right? Outside in is actually just by looking at what's out there and thinking through, is this something that could be relevant to us and attractive to our customers? So now taking the inside out approach, so we have, essentially, we look for 4 different types of partners. Right. So first of all, one sentence on Pulse. So we've had 31 different downloads in 18 different countries. Right. So Pulse is really the illustration of our health and wealth ecosystem. And within this ecosystem, we have 47 different partners in different regions. Right. So the 4 types of partners that we're looking for is, number 1 is value adding partners. Right. So anyone who can give us capabilities which we don't have.
Yep.
Number 2 is go-to-market partners, which is really distribution. Right. So we work with large platforms with lots of users, lots of data, and we distribute either Pulse or insurance products. The third type is content. So content partners, which give us anything from news articles to recipes, for example. Right. And then the fourth is really what we call marketplace. So marketplace partners or rewards, or essentially what we offer is a platform of lots of users where we can actually begin to sell different types of services and products. So we look for all these different partners within the 3 ecosystems that we have, which are health, wealth, and SME. Right. So, and you've mentioned, what do we buy versus build? Frankly, we're quite flexible. So anything that can give us something that we don't have and give us speed to market, I think is things that we can consider.
Okay. So how do you, what kind of sources of information do you use, and what sort of evaluation do you sort of use when you're looking to do a partnership? We've got a huge amount of startups that follow us and engage with us, and I think a lot of them will be very curious about sort of what happens with an insurer. What's the sort of decision-making process, and perhaps some of the criteria you use when you're trying to understand, I don't know, say diabetes. Say it's remote monitoring diabetes. There might be just within APAC 50 different solutions of various different types. How do you sort of start to, find the right solution that really matches what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, very good question. So for us, there has to be a value that really resonates with us. So whether it's coming in from the top line, for example, and for us, that's insurance premiums, right? So technologies that can enable us to sell more, right? Or whether it's coming in on the bottom line, which is more about, claims management, cost efficiencies, operational efficiencies, etc. Right? So it needs to fit in different areas. Or maybe it doesn't fit in this. It fits in areas such as customer experience, right? How do we actually engage your customers, right? And that translates into different numbers for us internally as well. Or even things like, data. Right, just understanding our customers and what they do. So there are different things that I think the startups can really clarify where they add value. And of course, internally, you have to find your stakeholders as well, right? So speak to the right people with the right kind of KPIs is also very important.
And that's a great segue to perhaps my last question, as we're coming up to the sort of half hour. A great many startups, I think, look in digital health to either pharmaceutical or insurance as potential sort of partners and distribution vehicles for their, products and services and innovation. What but I mean, I know this from my own experience working within an insurer, as well as sort of the external view. Sometimes insurers and any corporate it's hard to know how to approach them, what they're looking for. There's also a lot of regulatory and compliance, particularly with insurance. Sort of what advice would you give if you're a startup out there? Maybe you've got a reasonable level of maturity, you've got a proven market solution in a particular therapeutic area. What advice would you give to them if they're looking to do a partnership with somebody like Prudential?
Sure. So very good question, right? I'll be brief on this one. I know we're running out of time. So first, as I mentioned, so really define your value, right? Where you come in as your proposition, and define that very, very clearly for the insurer. Second of all, I would say find a champion, find an internal champion within the insurer who can actually help you navigate through the different departments, different teams, different subsidiaries, etc. Because all the insurers, I think you would agree, Matt, are very complex organizations. Yes. So find a champion that'll really support you throughout that long process. Yeah. Third, I would say, make sure that you find the right stakeholders as well. Right. So please don't be preaching to, whoever that your product is supposed to replace, right? Talk to somebody else, right, about the cost savings, right? So say the right things to the right stakeholders. I think that, that's really important. And then, and then lastly, I would say in terms of managing expectations, B2B is actually takes a long time. Right, so you need to make sure that you have a sufficient long runway. The POCs take time, and you cannot always just do POCs or free POCs even, right? So make sure that you manage your expectations, do a good job, and also do these short-term pilots with a goal of landing a long-term contract.
Yeah, that's great advice. I can certainly empathize with all of those. So value proposition, the internal champion is so important, right? Because you need somebody to help guide you through the myriad of decision makers and layers, and regional versus market and regional versus global and all that piece. So some great advice there. Scarlett, thank you so much. We're at the end of our time. It's breezed by very quickly. Thank you so much for joining us and for investing some time. And we hope to hear from you again soon.
Thank you. Well, my pleasure.
Thanks, Scarlett.